Healthy Planet, the show for people who care about their health and the health of our planet on the ThinkTech live streaming network series. I'm your host, Dr. Grace O'Neil. Joining me today is Dr. Ankur Jain, a local gastroenterologist. We will be talking about gut health today. Welcome, Dr. Jain. Thank you for being on the show. So March is Colon Cancer Awareness Month, so we wanted to touch base on digestive disorders related to what kind of things people are eating and how a plant-based diet can help digestive disorders. So let's start out from the top and go down, and I'm going to hand it to you.
Sure, Grace. Thanks for inviting me to speak today, and it's a pleasure to be here on your show. So, I think a lot of us know about the ecologic benefits, the ethical benefits, and there's a good deal of research on the health benefits of a plant-based diet on our gut. So, as you mentioned, pretty much from mouth all the way down to the large intestine or colon, you can see benefits throughout the GI tract. So, if you look at this slide here, this is just an example or sample of all the different diseases that are affected by meat intake or excessive meat intake. But just in the interest of timeliness in our show, I'll just highlight on a few of the important ones and definitely spend the most time on colon cancer because, as you mentioned, it is Colon Cancer Awareness Month. And also we have the most research and data on the benefits of plant-based diet on colon cancer prevention. So we can start off with gastroesophageal reflux disease or GERD. So GERD is a very common condition. Probably half the population has some symptoms of reflux disease, predominantly manifesting as heartburn and regurgitation, but there are some atypical symptoms as well. We know that diet and lifestyle plays a big role in gastroesophageal reflux disease. There are different factors that play into this. So there is a certain amount of acid that's being produced in the stomach to both digest the food and also help keep away the bacteria. Sometimes that acid does leak up into the esophagus. And when it does that, that's when we feel those symptoms of GERD or reflux disease. So that can be a various different combination of causes, either from the food that we're eating causing too much acidity in the stomach. It can be from the foods also affecting the tightening of that sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach, which helps control some of that acid from coming up. And then also from too much pressure that's building up also. For example, if we eat a large meal or we lie down right after eating, some of that acid can also head up. So as you can see, these are various different causes. Caffeine, spicy foods, peppermints, chocolates. But really what I want to focus on is meat or excessive meat in the diet, because that actually plays a role in all three of these factors or conditions, due to the fatty content of the food, and then also just the increase in abdominal pressure, particularly for people who are overweight. So that is something that we can work on, we can control to help with a lot of these lifestyle changes. There are medications that are available for reflux disease, but a lot of times the symptoms can be controlled with lifestyle.
So in regards to people having obesity, I know there's the situation where their stomach is kind of pressing up and it's causing the reflux, but isn't it also if you have more fiber in your diet, your transit of the food through the bowel is a lot faster, so then you don't have as much pressure from the constipation and the straining, which also worsens the reflux? Does that have a contribution?
So that's a good point. Most of that fiber effect, though, the benefit effect is actually on the large intestine. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. So in fact, actually, fiber tends to take a little bit longer to digest. So for people, for example, who have problems with gastric emptying, they may actually have more of a problem with high fat, high fiber diets. So those people, we actually recommend cutting down on that. But the fiber beneficial benefits are, like I said, largely on the large intestine, not so much on the reflux itself, or the reflux disease.
So how about the fatty diets and how they affect the acidity of the stomach? How does that affect the acidity of the stomach, like eating a lot of fat?
Sure. So, similarly, again, it just has to do with the amount of acid that's being produced because your body has to produce more acid to help digest all that food, the fats in the
It's just
food
hard to
that you're eating.
digest.
Harder to digest. So, because of that, more acid reflux. So, greasy meals, especially large greasy meals, are a known trigger for reflux disease.
Mhm. Okay, I'll let you go on to gastric cancer now.
Sure, sure. So, gastric cancer, as we know, is actually one of the most common cancers worldwide, and it's most predominant in East Asian countries. Of course, here in Hawaii, we have a large Asian population, so we do tend to see gastric cancer from time to time. It manifests in various different ways. Can be abdominal pain, can be recurrent nausea and vomiting. Some people present with bleeding from the stomach or ongoing weight loss. So these are all potential symptoms of gastric cancer. But specifically, what the focus, that I wanted to discuss is potential risk factors for gastric cancer. So we know for sure H. pylori, which is a type of bacterial infection which lives in the gut, as well as alcohol, smoking, and again obesity can be risk factors for gastric cancer. But there has been data and research also showing that smoked meats, smoked foods, fish, meats, lead to a production of nitrates, nitrosamines, and those can have a carcinogenic effect on the stomach and again lead to more gastric cancer. So again, anything we can do to help cut down the risk or prevent the risk, in this case also limiting that amount of meat, does play a role in gastric cancer prevention.
So, how about specifically, a lot of people are eating fish and they think that, fish is a health food, but in actuality, like, don't countries like Japan have a high rate of gastric cancer, whereas lower rates of other cancers because they have a high intake of fish? So,
Right.
that,
So that's a great point. So, in general, we know red meats are certainly very toxic on the gut. Asian countries, particularly Japan, for example, does have a high more of the seafood or fish content. So they may not have necessarily as much colon cancer, but gastric cancer definitely is higher there. And again, that probably has to do with a lot of that smoked foods, salty fish that they are exposed to. And yeah, gastric cancer is very common and actually much more common in Japan than the United States. So they have very aggressive protocols for testing for gastric cancer, much more than here in the United States, where we don't necessarily do screening as much as mostly just intervening if people are having symptoms or they have other risk factors. But yes, it is thought that that is probably the biggest risk factor. Now, raw foods in themselves, for example, sushi, have other risks, mostly for foodborne infections. So in general, we do recommend cooking foods, cooking meats if people were to eat them. But in this case, the smoked part of it or the salty part of it is probably what contributes to more gastric cancer.
all right, I guess let's go on to fatty liver disease, which is it's a major problem here because I'll see this on ultrasounds. I send my patient to an ultrasound of the gallbladder or something, and then it comes back that the gallbladder is normal, but they have fatty liver disease, and it's in like a third of the patients or something these days in the United States.
Yeah,
So
so unfortunately, obesity itself is a pandemic, right? So we're seeing that a lot more and more in younger patients, even kids developing fatty liver disease from obesity. So the two major causes of fatty liver disease are alcoholic and non-alcoholic. So alcoholic liver disease, as we know, the more alcohol you take in, the more damage it can do to the liver. But a lot of these patients are presenting with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So they have other risk factors such as obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol. All these lead to what's called a metabolic syndrome. And the metabolic syndrome is thought to have an oxidative stress or effect on the liver. Um, it's actually fast becoming one of the most common causes of advanced liver disease or cirrhosis, which in the past used to be hepatitis C. But because more people are being treated successfully for hepatitis C with some of our newer medications, that's actually becoming less common as far as advanced liver disease and NASH, or now one of the consequences of fatty liver disease, can eventually lead to cirrhosis and actually is thought to be the most common cause of advanced liver failure indications for liver transplant in women currently.
that's great.
So yeah, it's actually unfortunately definitely out there, but much like reflux disease, a lot of it also the management focuses on lifestyle changes. So there's a lot of different medications that are being tested, being studied. None has actually been approved as far as treating fatty liver disease. Only thing we know for sure is working on the metabolic syndrome, controlling blood sugars, cholesterol, and bringing down the weight. We know that even a 5 to 10% decrease in a patient's weight helps decrease the risk of the liver disease progressing. Because once you get to that advanced liver disease, the cirrhosis, that's when you can result in a lot of the complications from liver disease, such as bleeding from the stomach, comatose patients from this excess toxins that are building up in the blood, and even liver cancer. So really want to prevent it from getting to that stage by working on these risk factors.
And in a few years ago, go ahead.
I was going to say,
Sorry.
so, along those lines, again, just healthy diet, more plant-based, more fiber, less of the red meats, or less of the meats in general. Go ahead. Sorry for interrupting.
I interrupted you. I know a few years ago, you and your dad came to speak at the Vegan Society, which was then Vegetarian Society of Hawaii meeting, and you guys said that you had helped a lot of liver failure patients decrease their hepatic encephalopathy, which is, when people get altered mental status from liver failure from a high ammonia level, and you'd help them do that by decreasing their protein. And I thought that was very interesting because I've seen some other gastroenterologists say that people should continue to eat protein because they need it. But I think it makes a lot of sense what you said about decreasing your protein, because that is the waste product of protein, the ammonia. So can you go into that a little bit?
Right. So keep in mind that these patients are already malnourished. They have low albumins because it's not being produced by liver. So we wouldn't necessarily recommend a complete protein restriction. Certainly, certain sources of protein are worse than others. So again, if you focus more on the plant-based proteins as opposed to the animal-based proteins, that's probably healthier and safer. So not necessarily a full protein restriction or a protein overload either, but just more of the source of protein that these patients are taking in is very important. Because more protein excessive protein diets can actually lead to more encephalopathy. So again, not necessarily restricting, but proper sources of protein, plant-based is always going to be more beneficial.
Great. I guess just due to the time, let's go on to colon cancer, what we really wanted to concentrate on because it's Colon Cancer Awareness Month. So let's go on to that.
Sure. So that's actually one of my favorite topics. Actually, is colon cancer prevention, colon cancer screening. We know that colon cancer is the third most common cancer in the United States, the second most common cause of cancer-related deaths in the U.S. as well as here in Hawaii. And we also know that screening for colon cancer or detecting at an early stage is much more likely to result in effective treatment. So if we can catch these cancers early, they're actually about a 90% cure rate. But if we catch it at more later stages, for example, stage 3 or 4, which is the last stage of colon cancer, then that cure rate goes down to 50%. So screening or looking for these cancers before the onset of symptoms is really important, as with any other cancer, but particularly with colon cancer. Now, besides colon cancer, besides early detection, colon cancer is actually one of the only cancers where you can actually prevent it by detecting precancerous polyps. And so I'll talk a little bit about that on a later slide. But that's also one of the benefits of certain forms of screening tests where we can catch precancerous polyps early. But really what I want to discuss at this point is that although the overall rates of colon cancer have gone down during screening, we have been seeing a lot more younger patients developing colon cancer. And that's actually, as many of your audience has probably seen, has been in the media, very much so lately, particularly with high-profile cases, such as Black Panther actor who developed colon cancer at a young age and passed away from it. So it is something that's out there, something to be aware of, and it's actually affected our guidelines for colon cancer screening. But otherwise, getting back to what were you going to say?
Oh, no, I mean, I was just going to say, do you think that's because of some of the encouragement of the paleo diets, keto diets, this influencing younger people these days?
So, I do think diet has a big role in it. And again, I'm going to talk more about red meats and their effect on colon cancer. But again, probably has to do with more of the obesity, more focus on red meat diets. Unfortunately, if you look out there, if you go to McDonald's, it's a lot cheaper to get a fatty, meaty meal than it is to get a healthy salad. And that's unfortunate. But that's where we're seeing that's where the diet is really affecting, playing a role in a lot of these conditions. So, I think focusing on that plant-based diet again is once again very important in these cases. Some of the symptoms again to look out for colon cancer, because I know that's always a question. Patients may present with abdominal pain, may change with changes in their bowel habits. Rectal bleeding is a big one that needs to be investigated, even one episode, and unexplained weight loss. So these are all potential symptoms, but again, as I mentioned, in early stages, there may not be any symptoms at all. So it's really important to get screened on time.
So in regards to rectal bleeding, would you suppose somebody had that, would that person get a colonoscopy? I mean, if they had a positive, guaiac test or whatever?
Right. So stool tests are a way to screen for colon cancer if somebody's not having symptoms. So definitely, if a screening test is positive like this, then the person should undergo a colonoscopy to follow up on it. So those are two-step tests. Anything besides a colonoscopy, a stool test, an X-ray test, if it shows anything abnormal, needs to be followed up with a colonoscopy. So I think this slide that they just put up there shows that the different types of screenings out there, and so that includes stool tests. So there's certain stool tests that need to be done every year. Different types of stool tests, and those actually show blood in the stool or are called blood in the stool. There are screening tests that can be done every 3 years, testing for DNA in the blood, abnormal DNA in the stool, sorry. X-ray test that can be done as well. And then the colonoscopy, which is that last option given there, which has the longest protective interval. So all of these other tests besides the colonoscopy are done, in different intervals. And if there's anything abnormal, need to be followed up with a colonoscopy in a short period of time. Otherwise, it can be more dangerous if there are any delays. But getting back to your point about rectal bleeding, so bleeding is a little bit different because the person's actually having symptoms. So then you don't really need a screening test. At that point, it's more of a diagnostic test. Patients having symptoms, no matter what their age, they really need to be investigated with a colonoscopy. And in those cases, if there are symptoms, for whatever reason, if the patient is a higher risk, they have a family history of colon cancer or other risk factors, we wouldn't do any of those other screening tests. We would just go straight to a colonoscopy. Now, during COVID, a lot of people have been delaying their tests. Unfortunately, people were scared about getting COVID or had other risk factors they were concerned about. So that's actually led to a lot of delays, which unfortunately may lead to people being diagnosed at later stages. So that's a big concern right now. Now, some of those people are coming back now, which is good. But really, again, it boils down to getting screened on time. And for people who are still concerned about COVID, that stool test is an option to be done at home. But again, as long as you remember or you realize that if it is abnormal, then that colonoscopy should be followed up after that. Again, we tell people the best screening test is the one that gets done.
Yeah. How about that? There's an advertisement for that Cologuard or something like that. What are your comments on that?
Right. So the Cologuard is actually that fecal DNA test. So it is being covered now by most insurances. That was a problem before as far as coverage. So that's a good thing is it is being covered. The benefits are it's done every 3 years if it's normal or negative. But like any other test, if it is abnormal, it does need a colonoscopy to follow up.
Okay,
And
but you can maybe do that and not do a colonoscopy for those people who are skittish, or what do you think?
yeah, so that's an option as long as it's negative. We tend to see a little bit more false positives, meaning the test will come back positive and there's no evidence of anything abnormal on the follow-up colonoscopy. So that is one of the downsides for some of these tests, that there may be false positives, but that is kind of a trade-off. You'd rather have something be potentially something dangerous and then be reassured everything's okay, as opposed to missing something because it's not picking enough things up. So that's one of the trade-offs with those types of stool tests.
Yeah, no, and then you could. It's good. So it's just a stool test. So then, if you did that every 3 years, you could maybe, if you were scared of getting a colonoscopy, you could avoid
Yeah,
one.
exactly right. So that's an option. And then Because of that early onset colon cancer, those younger patients developing cancer, the guidelines have changed over the last couple of years. So rather than 50, now all patients are recommended to start screening no later than age 45. And again, maybe sooner, depending if they have a family history of colon cancer or other risk factors. So getting that first test done is really important. And whether people choose to do a stool test, x-ray, or colonoscopy, whichever one, should start. And then depending what that result shows, then the further follow-ups are recommended. So usually we recommend screening from 45 up to 75. After 75, the risks of screening, particularly colonoscopies, tend to go up a little bit. The benefits are going down. And then after 85, we usually don't recommend routine screening anymore. But 75 to 85 is kind of a case-by-case basis, depending on how healthy the patients are.
Now, if you're just going to get the stool test, would you need to go to a gastroenterologist for that if it's covered by your insurance, or could you just go to your primary care doctor?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So stool tests and even X-rays can be ordered by a primary care physician. So I encourage people to be proactive. If they've not had tests done, their doctor hasn't recommended it, just go ahead and ask them, hey, I think I'm due. And that's something they can arrange. And again, if everything is normal, negative, and they're good for whatever interval is recommended. But again, they have to keep in mind if anything is abnormal, they should still be prepared to do a colonoscopy afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great because sometimes it can take people a while to get in with a gastroenterologist because you guys are pretty busy, So at least they can go to their primary care doctor.
Right. And actually, with all those delays during COVID, people are starting to come back now. We have the new screening age. So, yeah, so it is, it is getting busier as gastroenterologists. And unfortunately, there's still a shortage. There's a shortage in neighbor islands, especially. You'll see a lot less gastroenterologists there. It's hard getting testing done. And we've also seen during COVID, a lot of the minorities that, already at high risk for late stage disease, they've also had disproportionately less screening done. So those are also, unfortunately, more affected. Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, they're already at risk for later stages and also been delayed during COVID. So it's kind of a double whammy, but, all patients, regardless of, ethnicity, really need to be screened on time. That's really important.
Yeah, it's very important. So let's talk about some of the risk factors and prevention of colon cancer.
Sure. So we know that there are some irreversible risk factors that includes a family history of colon cancer, colon polyps, inflammatory bowel disease, diabetes, certain polyp conditions, genetic conditions that can predispose patients. But really what we want to focus on is the reversible risk factors. So that includes diet. So we really want to focus on a diet high in fiber and minimizing in the red meats, processed meats, and greasy foods. That's really critical as far as colon cancer prevention. Also limiting or avoiding smoking, alcohol, and then once again, obesity. So these are all known risk factors for colon cancer. Really, the focus is on red meats and processed meats. We know actually the World Health Organization about 5 years ago or so, 6 years ago, they actually published a report that red meats and processed meats are at least class 2 carcinogens, meaning at risk, put people at risk for colon cancer. So that's actually similar to smoking risk for lung cancer. So that was actually a big eye opener. And that was based on multiple different studies that had been done in the past, looking at the effects of red meat and development of cancer, cancer of the gut. So it's thought that, once again, colon cancer, or once again, these meats are actually broken down in the gut and form carcinogenic compounds. Nitrosamines, these are have oxidative stress on the colon. They have direct carcinogenic effect, meaning they cause mutations in the lining of the cell. And these are thought to actually lead to this colon cancer, which again, in majority of cases will rise from colon polyps. So multiple studies have shown that people on vegetarian diets, for example, Seventh-day Adventists, Buddhists, they have an overall less risk of colon cancer development. And really, the most important recommendation we can give is maximize the fiber and minimizing those other meats.
So how about people with, have you seen people with Crohn's disease? And I mean, you must have a lot of Crohn's and ulcerative colitis patients. Have you seen any results with people going plant-based, and has that helped? Because ulcerative colitis patients have a very high risk of colon cancer, obviously. Has that helped them to go plant-based? I mean, having had any patients that have done that and maybe decrease their incidence of colon cancer, or I don't.
Yeah, so
Just
that's
wondering.
a question that's come up before, and we so no studies have shown necessarily that plant-based will prevent Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis or prevent a flare. So if patients have have inflammatory bowel disease, they definitely need to be on the proper recommended treatments. But as an adjunct to that, plant-based diets can help at least maintain remission or maintain disease-free states. So although I'm a very big proponent of plant-based diets, those alone may not be sufficient to keep disease under control. But again, they can complement other medications, other treatments that the doctors recommended. So it's definitely something that's important. Now, the one caveat, if somebody's having acute symptoms, fiber in those cases actually can cause more symptoms because it is causing more kind of stress on the intestines when it's already inflamed. So in those cases, or people who are having, say, for example, acute GI upset, diarrhea, you want to back off on that fiber, stay more on a kind of a low residue, soft, bland diet. But once those symptoms are better, once the disease is controlled, then going back to a good amount of fiber, or and less of the meats again.
So just because we haven't, I know it was on your list, but you didn't have a specific slide. I wanted to just touch a little bit on gallstones before we have to wrap it up. So what is your take on plant-based diet for gallstones?
So fatty foods, again, are going to be a risk factor for gallstones. Actually, some of the main risk factors, again, diabetes, obesity, high-fat diets can lead to more stones forming in the gallbladder. So your gallbladder actually stores bile, which helps break down fats in the blood. And sometimes that bile can get saturated and lead to these stone formations. So just in general, as with anything else, more plant-based, less of the meats, less obesity is going to help decrease the risk of gallstones. Again, may not eliminate the risk completely, but at least for people who are more at risk, can help them or benefit them.
And have you seen people after gallbladder surgery? Because I know I see them in the emergency room. They have a lot of digestive problems. And some people, it's because of a specific problem with the surgery where they didn't remove like a portion of the cystic duct or something. But sometimes people continue to eat the way they did before the surgery, and they continue to have problems like kind of like diarrhea sometimes when they eat fatty meals. Have you seen patients complaining of that in your clinic? Or
Yeah, so that happens sometimes, especially in the initial months after surgery, because the bile no longer is stored by the gallbladder. It's actually leaking out into the gut. And eventually the small intestine takes that role over. But initially, at least, you might see more of that bile acid related diarrhea. So cutting down on fatty foods, limiting fatty food intake, at least while that acute issues get better or the body adapts to it, might help with some of the symptoms.
absolutely. But I guess now we're out of time, so we have to wrap it up. But this is Dr. Grace O'Neil. This is Healthy Planet on the ThinkTech live streaming network series. We've been talking with Dr. Ankur Jain, a gastroenterologist. Thanks to Ash, our broadcast engineer, and the rest of the crew at ThinkTech for hosting our show. And thanks to you, our listeners, for listening. And I will see you in 2 weeks for more of Healthy Planet on ThinkTech, the show for people who care about their health and the health of our planet. My special guest will be Brandy Shimabukuro from the Hawaiian Humane Society. If you have ideas for the show or questions for my future show guests, please contact me at healthyplanetthinkTech@gmail.com. Check out my website at graceinhawaii.com or Instagram at graceful living365 for more information on my projects, including future show guests. I'm Dr. Grace O'Neil. Aloha, everyone.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.